We're just about to go in. Stephen, can you hear me okay? Aye, Stephen, good morning to you. Bruce Crawford here, the convener of the Referendum-Bill Committee. We're just about to go live, so what I'll try to remember to do is I come to various MSPs as to say who they are, so that you know it, because I know you can't see nameplates, although you have a table plan, I understand. I did have yes. Okay. Right. I'll tell you, maybe the best thing to do is when we start off, if each individual MSP could remind Stephen who you are as we begin the process, it'll help us. And Stephen, just before we start, is there anything you want to say as by way of an opening statement, or you just want to get straight into questions? Not just now, but...
I can make an opening statement, and convene if you so wish, just maybe to outline my function
okay.
in respect of the registration of electors.
Okay, that would be helpful. And in which case, are we ready to begin? Okay, we can let members of the public in, please, if they're out there in their droves. Right, apologies. Right, good morning, colleagues. Welcome to the fourth meeting of the Referendum Scotland Bill Committee. Our first piece of work this morning is a discussion with Stephen Carse, who's the Registration Officer of the Isle of Man Government. Welcome, Stephen, and thank you for coming along to our proceedings. Stephen, I wonder if you want to start off by just making an overall general statement about your position and what you do. It would be helpful to us.
I will, thank you, and thank you for the invitation, and I hope that what I have to say might be of some use to your deliberations. I'm the Acting Registration Officer for the Isle of Man Government and have undertaken this particular role since January 1989, so I've got 24 years of experience behind me in this regard. The responsibility itself is not, in fact, my major role within government. I act as government's economic advisor, and I inherited the role of registration officer when I took up post in 1989. Essentially, the responsibilities of the registration officer are dealt with in the Isle of Man under the Registration of Electors Act 2006. And essentially, my duties are concerned with the preparation, the maintenance and the revision of the Register of Electors. Attendant duties are to do with the distribution of that register and the hearing of appeals, objections and so on, and ultimately then the final revisions to the register. To help me do this, I have within my division, which is a part of the Government Treasury, we have 4 professionals and 7 support staff who, as well as helping the professionals in their everyday duties, these are the staff who are mainly responsible for the compilation and the administration of the electoral registers. If I can briefly outline the procedures involved, we build up the register from the local electricity company's database, which has a comprehensive coverage of all properties on the island. Eligibility for registration is fairly straightforward. You have to have lived on the island for more than a year, and you have to be over the age of 15. We register on a household basis. We have yet to fully consider individual registration, although it has been spoken about politically. We produce a register, or rather revisions to the register, every quarter. And in our elections, we have 24 elected members across 15 constituencies. So in some of those constituencies, there is more than one representative.
Thank you, Stephen. That's a helpful overview. I wonder, in terms of your experience that you had in terms of those voting from 16 and 17-year-olds, if you can provide us with a brief overview of the process of lowering the voting age in the Isle of Man, and then I'll open up to general questions. But if you could just provide that general sort of overview, I think it would be helpful.
Yes. We had, if I can go back to 2005, 2006, we had a sort of combination of changes which were happening at the time. We had a registration of electors bill going through the Houses rather. Their passage was commenced in December of 2005. We also had a representation of the People Amendment Bill going through at the same time. And we also had, as an internal matter, the fact that our mainframe computer systems, which handled our registration and our registers, was about to be dismantled. That was going to happen by May 2006. So we were going to not so much lose the database of names and households and so on, but we found that not all of the details on existing registers could be readily transferred over to the new software that we had to use in the event of the loss of the mainframe. So we had three situations arising there which we needed to be aware of from an administrative perspective. The Registration of Electors Act, when it began its passage in December 2005, was essentially just going to do one thing, and that was to move us onto a rolling register basis. Prior to the Act, we produced an annual register on the September 1st every year, and that couldn't be changed. So clearly we were having a situation where people who would otherwise be eligible to vote were in fact being disenfranchised because of the long lead-in and the fact that a register lasted for 1 year. So the main purpose of the Registration of Electors Bill was to enable me as registration officer henceforth to produce revisions to the registers on a quarterly basis. At the second reading of that particular bill, I think we were now into February 2006, a member successfully moved an amendment to lower the voting age from 18 to 16. That clause was accepted. I think it was 19 in favour and 4 against. It subsequently, in May, also got included in the representation of the People Amendment Bill, which, as I said before, was going through simultaneously. So as was necessary, we had the age of 16 entered in those two important pieces of legislation. Both of those bills, I think, completed their passage in March of 2006, and they received royal assent on July the 11th and accepted in our Parliament Tynwald on July the 12th of 2006.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. That's a helpful overview. Annabel Goldie, I think you wanted to ask a question.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Carse.
Morning.
I'm interested in the period between when the law actually changed and when your first election came along. Now, do I understand from what you were saying that everybody knew from about February 2006 the voting age was going to be reduced, and your election was, I think, November 2006?
Yes, the election date was November 23rd, and there was always a strong possibility that, subsequent to royal assent being given, that we would be dealing with a register which would now have to include 16 and 17-year-olds.
did this mean that you were able to start preparing in advance? I mean, I think forms were going out in January, February and March of 2006.
Yeah, the normal procedure we were following anyway, which was to canvass the population in, well, essentially from January onwards. So we were compiling the register on the original basis, on the traditional basis, whilst fully expecting royal assent to be given in July, so that we could also include the 16 and 17-year-olds. Out that the rolling register provisions would be accepted and brought in. So we were operating on the basis that we would have to compile a rolling register.
And am I correct in saying your population is about 84,000, approximately?
Yes. Yes, 84,000, yeah.
And I know there was concern, there was an inquiry held in the Tynwald about the element of disenfranchisement. And I wonder if you could tell us a little more about what that inquiry discovered.
Yes, because we were about to lose key database. We had to effectively start afresh in the compilation of the register in 2006. So whereas previous registers will have had an accumulation of details, names of individuals who were on the registers, but who might have left the island, they certainly had not registered for a couple of years, it meant that inevitably the numbers that we would have on the new registers were going to be less than what they were previously. If you like, we were shaking out those who were no longer living on the island, and also those who had apparently no interest in renewing their appearance on the registers.
So at the end of the day, the number of people entitled to vote but didn't end up voting, was it significant?
Well, the numbers who were entitled to vote and who did vote, that ratio, if you like, was probably unchanged. It's just that we were, in the process, we were eliminating from the new registers those who either A, were not eligible because they'd subsequently left the island, and B, those who might have registered sometime in the distant past but had refused the opportunity to renew that enlistment in subsequent years, and who, when we opened up in 2006, again did not bother to seek to register.
I think my final question, Convener, is roughly you had a period between February 2006 and November 2006 to get the register into fit-for-purpose shape. Was that enough time? Were you under pressure?
At the time of a general election, we're always under pressure, I guess. Things are much more relaxed in the intervening 5 years, and then it comes to a general election, and naturally political and public interest is a lot more focused on the accuracy and the size of the register that we've managed to compile. But no, we didn't need any extra staff. We gave a bit more overtime, as I recall, in the peak months. But no, we fared quite comfortably. There was a certain degree of public misunderstanding as to why the numbers had gone down. And the inquiry to which you related at the outset of your questioning, which was undertaken by a local advocate, a Mr. John Wright, that particular inquiry was initiated, I think, partly because of a less than full understanding of why the numbers were down. The initial reaction was that numbers were down because the administration had not been correct, that we were not performing our task, if you like. The report concluded that, in fact, we were fully up to the task, and the reasons why the numbers were down was simply because we had eliminated all those who'd either left the island, and we were now excluding those who'd not bothered to respond to the latest request.
Very much.
Thank you, Annabelle. I think James Kelly wants to ask a question now.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Convener. Morning, Mr Cass. James Kelly. You outlined in your opening statement the way the process was changed for those who were over 15 to be on the register and therefore entitled to vote. Was there anything in the process which allowed those who were 15 and approaching their 16th birthday to pre-register?
Yes. We have a system whereby anyone who is approaching the voting age, and prior to 2006 that was obviously 18, so we always had what we call the attainers, those who were coming up to the eligible date, the eligible age. We would put them on the register alongside their name and address on the register. We would have the date at which they would attain voting age. So it didn't matter that you, in the current context, were not going to be 16. If you were coming up to that age, you could complete the registration form, or in practice, add your name to the household registration form, and you would subsequently be entered on the register.
Okay, and were the names of 15-year-olds who registered in that way published on the register at that time, where they were still 15, or were they kept as a separate list?
They were published on the register.
Okay.
So long as they were going to become eligible to vote in the subsequent quarter. As a bearing in mind, at the same time, we were adapting to a once-a-year register to a quarterly. So if someone was age 14 and they sent in the application, we wouldn't add it in that case. We would add it in the context of them being close to becoming 16.
Did that lead to any data protection or child protection issues, bearing in mind you're publishing the names of 15-year-olds in a public document?
It didn't raise any concerns in respect of data protection. It was discussed during the passage of the bill, particularly in the Upper House Legislative Council, in respect of human rights and a convention on the rights of children. There were some concerns expressed.
And what view ultimately was taken when the legislation was passed?
The concerns, I think, were merely noted, but certainly when the legislation was introduced, there was no provision for either the creation of a side register, as is happening in Scotland, I understand, and there were no moves to have the identification of such individuals removed.
Okay, that's interesting. Just then, in terms of, again, you outlined at the start that they used the electricity company's database to identify households in terms of your canvass. Was there anything, did you have anything specific to be able to identify 16 and 17-year-olds or those approaching 16 so that they could be targeted as such?
Are you asking the question in terms of how we could actually get 16 and 17-year-olds interested enough to register?
Yeah, I'm interested in it. Obviously, there's a new element to the franchise, and using your existing processes, you're simply identifying households. You don't know specific 15, 16 and 17-year-olds are out there. So do you have any mechanism for identifying that group and making a particular appeal to get them onto the register?
No, we don't. Our data protection officer was concerned that we didn't use any existing information, whether that be school rolls or information from other departments of government. So we were not able to match records in that way. So all we could do was just address the issue in a more general sense, and to try and raise the media profile of the matter. To do that, we took out public notices. We had a stream of interviews and related articles in the press. We went to the schools, and we put posters in the secondary schools. Some of the schools sent out registration forms alongside GCSE results, which was an interesting initiative. So we did what we thought was as much as we could in terms of raising the profile of the matter. But it was a relatively short space of time because, of course, the royal assent was not given until July the 12th. So the time that we had to raise the matter, to raise awareness of the matter, to raise interest in the matter was relatively restricted. And I think that was shown by the relatively small numbers who did actually register in 2006 compared to the numbers that we have now.
What were the numbers that were registered in 2006, if you've got them to hand?
Okay. Yes, I have them in front of me. In 2006, we also had a census in 2006, population census, which was also run out of my office. And those census results would have indicated that the maximum numbers who would have been eligible of 16 and 17-year-olds was 2001. I say maximum because some of those would not have been living here for the required 12 months. All I've given you there is the total numbers who were aged 16 and 17 at the time.
Right. And of those 2001, do you know how many registered?
Yes, 689, which is 34.4%. And of those, I can tell you that 397 voted. So out of the 689 registered, the turnout was 57.6.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I think Annabel Ewing also wants to ask you a question, Stephen.
Yes, thank you, Convener, and good morning. Mr Carse, just really following on from that discussion. Good morning. So I note that in terms of the briefing we have been helpfully provided with from our clerks, that moving on towards the 2011 election, further initiatives were undertaken to encourage voter registration for 16 and 17-year-olds and presumably to encourage a higher turnout figure. And I understand that in particular you had organised some informal information sessions called Vote Right that were held at the Islands Youth Cafe in Douglas. And I just wonder if you could explain what kind of form those sessions took, and also if there was a direct correlation on an increased registration further to those information awareness initiatives.
In fact, I am not particularly familiar with that particular initiative, and I didn't attend that. But there was a whole stream of things going on in the build-up to the 2011 general elections. Bear in mind also that we'd had 5 years of a drip-drip effect on awareness and so on. I think the most impressive thing that we did, and which undoubtedly would have helped registration rates and indeed turnout rates on the day, was we produced a video, a DVD/video, which was produced by the local students at a college. It was based upon something which a Lancashire council had produced. I think it was Preston Council had produced something similar. So we pretty much copied that. And the film was put on monitors at every secondary school. It was put on YouTube. It was referred to and was accessible through Twitter. It was also placed on a couple of local websites, Manx.net and Manx.tube, which are very popular with local teenagers. And we just intensified the whole thing. We were doing more interviews with the press than perhaps we did in 2006, more interviews, more coverage on radio. So there was a whole host of things going on in 2011. And I think that was reflected in the far better figures for 2011 If you would like me to give you those, I can read them out.
Yes, please. That would be very helpful.
You'd like to? Okay. The maximum eligible was 2,052, of whom 1,234 registered, which is 60.1. And of those, 668 voted. Now, that turnout rate is 54.1, which was actually lower than in 2006, which is interesting. So we got more onto the registers with the eligibility to vote, but marginally fewer actually did turn out on the day. I suspect what's happened there is that in the intervening years, the head of household has started to include the 16 and 17-year-olds on their returns, but perhaps we've not raised the propensity to vote as much as we might have liked.
Presumably that might be something to do with the political debate. Who knows? It's an imponderable, I guess. But it's very interesting to note the increased registration figure, taking into account the increased, it seems from what you've been saying, increased information awareness activities, and perhaps that's something we could take on board here in Scotland from the outset. And it would also be very helpful if you could, in due course, provide our clerks with a link to your video, because I'm sure we would be interested to have a look at that. If I may, Convener, ask one further question, which is just looking at the issue in general in terms of the principle of the issue of the lowering of the voting age. And I wonder if it is the case at all that there is any serious clamouring in the Isle of Man to reverse the decision of 2006 to lower the voting age to 16 and 17-year-olds, i.e. to increase it again to 18.
Certainly politically, I am not aware of any moves to do that. When the bill was going through, there was an overwhelming majority passing the amendment clauses. So no, I don't think there is. In terms of the public perception and public opinions, I think there was a great deal of scepticism initially. Now, because we are talking about a change which happened 7 years ago, there's a far greater acceptance, I would guess. So no, in answer to your question in one word, no.
Thanks very much, Mr. Kerr.
Stephen, before I go to Patrick Harvey, could you just give us, for the 2011 election, the general overall numbers who voted and the turnout, so we can compare it with what happened with the 16, 17-year-olds? I think that would be helpful as a benchmark.
I can tell you that the total registered in 2006 was about 52,000, and by 2011 it was up to 58,000. Again, an element of that 58 would have been that we were still leaving people on, even if they'd not responded to the previous canvassing requests. But nevertheless, the population was expanding between 2006 and 2011, so we would have naturally expected an increase. Unfortunately, I've forgotten to bring with me, or I've not brought with me rather, the turnout rates for the whole of the population in 2006 and 2011, but I can readily supply that, no problem.
No worries, we'll get that later from you. Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Just to follow on from Annabel Ewing's questions there about registration and participation. Here, registration takes place at a local government level. The Electoral Commission nationally promotes awareness of the election and participation neutrally in the election, and obviously the candidates and political parties promote participation in their favour. Is there a separate function in your jurisdiction around promotion of participation in similar ways the Electoral Commission does here? And to what extent was there any kind of barrier, particularly in relation to schools and colleges, facilitating not only the promotion of registration but the promotion of participation? For example, candidates coming in on a mutual basis, a neutral basis, to have panel sessions with young people to encourage them to participate. We have no links with the Electoral Commission.
So pretty much all of the efforts in respect of registration, at least, fall at the door of my section. Not so much in turnout. We facilitate things and we might participate in events, but we focus, my particular responsibilities are just focusing on the process rather than, if you like, the political dimension of getting people, particularly the youngsters, interested in using that vote. There were various things going on to raise awareness, and someone alluded to cafe meetings and so on amongst the youngsters. We also have what's called a junior debate, a junior Tynwald debate. Tynwald, as you'll be aware, is our parliament. And I think in July 2011, there was one specifically convened, which raised a great deal of interest. In those sessions, the youngsters come in and they take the places of the MHKs, the political representatives, and they go through the formal procedures on a typical day of Tynwald and ask each other questions on various things. And so that was very useful. It was covered extensively by the media, and I'm sure helped to raise interest in the whole upcoming general elections of which was in 2011, had been moved forward to September by then. So, there's a whole host of things going on. I say my role in the background is to facilitate and raise awareness of registration issues.
But is there any barrier, either legally or in any other sense, to schools facilitating the involvement of candidates in promoting either registration or participation?
Not as far as I'm aware, because I can recall discussing whether we being a group of officers wish to convene such things within school premises.
Okay,
and we were not told that we could.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Stuart Maxwell.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Cass. Can I take you back to the 2006 process? Did you undertake any particular staff training, particularly staff who were working in polling stations, and any other staff who were involved in the election process, to perhaps anticipate dealing with younger voters who are coming for the first time, 16 and 17-year-olds, to vote? And if you did, what training did you undertake? And secondly, was there any problems that you're aware of that occurred at polling stations in the process of new young voters coming to vote for the first time?
I have to say at the outset that, again, my duties start and finish at the registration. So we're not involved in the day at the polling stations or whatever. We man the phones in case someone is complaining at the polling stations that they should be on the register, but now they've turned up to vote and they've been stopped from doing so because their names do not appear on the register. So we are involved in that respect on the actual day of the election, but otherwise, no, we don't have a physical presence at the polling stations. Our duties are more or less over by the time we produce the register that will apply to the election.
Well, given you man phones in terms of any problems that may arise, were you aware of any problems that did arise in terms of 16 and 17-year-olds turning up to vote who didn't understand they had to get on the registration, the register, or did it effectively go pretty smoothly? Were they effectively the same as the rest of the population?
Yes, I was not made aware of any specific instance where a 16-year-old specifically had found him or herself unable to vote because they weren't on the register. Generally speaking, the whole election in 2006 went okay.
Can I just one final question, Convener? Was there any follow-up work done on the process? Was there any survey work done following the 2006 election to examine the process and to see whether it had gone as smoothly as you'd hoped it would, in terms of actually the understandings of new voters and the actual process at polling stations themselves?
As was alluded to earlier, there was a report commissioned into the 2006 elections and that was focused on specifically the registration procedure, because the numbers were so far down on what we'd been used to in the past, and the reasons for that I've already explained, and they were the same reasons as given within the final report. So, no, there was nothing specifically commissioned in respect of registration rates or turnout rates of 16 to 17-year-olds.
Thank you.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. Just regarding the election in 2011, also there was the right review in 2007 regarding 2006, but was there a review after the 2007 elections with a focus towards the 16 and 17-year-olds?
No. We have, after every general election, we convene a meeting between my people, the returning officers, other people involved at some stage in the whole election process. But there was nothing, at those meetings, there was nothing specifically raised in respect of difficulties or otherwise affecting 16 or 17-year-olds.
Okay, thank you. And just regarding the 2006 elections, the first election, 2006, when you had it was from the February up until the November time to get the register into the correct and appropriate shape. And you said earlier on in your evidence that you dealt with it quite comfortably and it was enough time. With the situation that we have here in Scotland, obviously the debate is taking place now, it's been taking place certainly for some period of time, and with the referendum due in the autumn of 2014, do you think that, that here in Scotland we actually have enough time to get the register into the correct and appropriate shape for the referendum?
I'm not too sure I'm in a position to say anything definitive on that, but certainly the longer the time, the better, clearly, to state the obvious. And I think the benefit you do have is it's such a high-profile issue anyway, and there's been a run-in even up to this point in terms of the importance of the whole issue, then I would expect that you would be more successful in getting the youngsters to register and then subsequently to actually turn out and vote.
Okay, thank you very much.
Could I ask one sort of general question at the end of this process, Stephen? In terms of your role, what you've undertaken, what you've seen, what do you think are the lessons that we could take from the Isle of Man into the Scottish experience from any particular challenges that you faced in a wider sense in regard to the introduction of 16 and 17-year-olds voting?
The only difficulties we did actually have in the whole thing in adapting to 16-year-old and 17-year-old voting was that you're starting from a position of ignorance amongst the 16 and 17-year-olds. Recall that in the Isle of Man, the change comes somewhat out of the blue, if you like. It was a bill that was going through to introduce quarterly registration, quarterly production of electoral lists. And during that process, we had the amendment which introduced the reduction in the age to 16 and 17. There'd been no significant prior political debate or public debate on the merits of 16 and 17-year-olds being given the vote. So again, there you in Scotland will have that advantage that it has already been debated. You know that there's a very good chance it's going to be coming, so the awareness levels are already there. With us, it wasn't just a case of having 4 or 5 months to administer. We only had 4 or 5 months to raise awareness and to get it embedded in the psyche of the kids that this was a great new opportunity that they were going to be presented with. Again, in terms of the administration, the actual introduction of 16 and 17-year-old voting was a minor administrative issue compared with having to do quarterly registration. That's what required the most changes in the software that we were using to just change the eligible date the eligible age from 18 to 16 was only a tweak to that particular software program.
Okay.
So that part of it was pretty minor.
Okay. I don't have any other general questions. Anybody else got any questions they want to pick up, Stephen? Okay, Stephen, thank you very much for giving us some evidence this morning. Very helpful. And our best wishes to the Tynwald and the House of Keys. And thank you very much, sir.
Thank you for inviting me, and I hope my contribution has been of some use, and I will pass on those regards to our members.
Thank you. Colleagues, we'll just have a break for a couple of moments now to sort out the IT system, and we get Mr Blair to come and join us. Thank you. Okay. Colleagues, we reconvene after that short break, and we have, in the next session of evidence taking, we've got Gordon Blair, who's the Deputy Returning Officer for West Lothian Council and the Chair of Solar's Election Working Group. Welcome, Gordon, and thank you for coming along this morning and helping us out with our deliberations. Just as a sort of general question at the beginning to set the scene, and a starter for 10, the committee are quite interested in the role of the counting officers in referendums, in particular in the relationship with chief counting officers and possibly the Electoral Management Board itself, and obviously where EROs and returning officers and counting officers relate to each other. I think just give us an overview. I think that would be helpful.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. In a nutshell, the counting officer is the operational role, conducts the poll, conducts the count locally. The chief counting officer has the role to ensure the proper and effective conduct of the referendum, both locally, overseeing it, and with the power of direction to counting officers locally. So it's not just a coordinating role, it is in fact a functional role as well, and obviously at the end to certify the national result. The relationship with the electoral registration officers is quite simply that the EROs produce the register and the absent voter lists for postal voting. The relationship with the Electoral Management Board for Scotland is that it has a coordinating role for elections, and if the convener of the EMB is the chief counting officer, for example, if that were to be the case, then clearly the EMB's role would be to advise the CCO and issue or assist with the issue of guidance from the CCO to local counting officers and the conduct of the poll, and to issue any particular directions which then become mandatory to follow. The relationships on the ground, I think, are excellent up till now, fostered particularly, I think, through the EMB. There's a good working relationship both locally and nationally with the EROs and the returning officers who will become counting officers, and that the close working relationship, I have no reason to think that that will not continue for the referendum.
So when the Parliament eventually passes this particular bill, where it got this under discussion today, and obviously as part of the context of the referendum bill, then the Election Management Board will produce advice, guidance and general direction for all the counting officers in Scotland, and try to ensure that there's a consistency across Scotland, and that would be the general purpose of it.
I think technically the power will lie with the chief counting officer, but the Electoral Management Board will clearly be the forum that the chief counting officer will use as a sounding board on an operational basis. So between the two, yes, and the CCO's power of direction will come into play, so that it's not just guidance, it'll be directions in the most key areas for the purpose of, for example, consistency, as you mentioned.
Thank you very much. James Kelly, I think, wanted to ask a question.
Okay, thanks a lot, Convener, and good morning, Mr Blair. I just want to focus a couple of questions in relation to 16 and 17-year-olds around polling station organisation and also on the timing of the count. Clearly, assuming this legislation passes, you know, many 16 and 17-year-olds, we hope, would take the opportunity to participate in the referendum process. And as they turn up on polling day at their polling station, you know, we want to ensure that the experience is as efficient as possible, so that, you know, they can vote clearly and that they will then return in future elections. And it's also true to say that there will be a lot of people, not 16 and 17-year-olds, but among the general population, who will probably vote for the first time. So has there any specific consideration been given to making sure that the voting experience is as smooth as possible in terms of the referendum?
Not as yet. I think it's too early, but that will be, I think, the focus of attention on two fronts. One will be awareness raising generally, and that starts off With the Electoral Commission, it's proposed that they have the power to provide information to voters under one of the clauses of the Referendum-Bill. And locally, we will need to tie into that and continue the consistent messages coming from the Electoral Commission, continue that on the ground locally. The other factor that will come into play will be the extent to which we would need to support polling staff, and the polling staff actually issuing the ballot papers, support them with additional staff as information providers, for example. We've done that before in council elections for STV, and a combination of the two, awareness training beforehand and then on polling day. That, I think, is how it will be affected. The other gap will be postal voters. Now, that's what they get through their postal vote package is very much regulated by legislation. But again, at the point that they vote is not at the polling station. So they will need to be given some attention in terms of if there's anything in particular that we need to address in the postal voting package as to how to explain how to vote procedurally. These are issues that will still need to be picked up, and they will certainly be picked up by the EMB, I'm quite sure, and the Chief Counting Officer.
Okay, just in terms of, you mentioned, polling station staff and the need for, additional support for polling station staff. We wouldn't want a situation arising where 16 and 17-year-olds were arriving to vote for the first time and there was an unnecessary queue at the polling station. And bearing in mind, some people have said the turnout in this referendum might be as high as 80%. Will consideration be given to, perhaps, increasing the number of polling districts and therefore, the number of polling stations within or polling districts within the polling station in order to move voters smoothly and efficiently through the station on polling day?
Simple answer to that is yes. One of the risk assessment areas in every election is the polling scheme, as we call it, which is the number of polling stations within each polling place. And that number of stations is determined by a number of factors, not least what we estimate to be the likely turnout, just as a rule of thumb. The higher the turnout we expect, the more stations we need so that the throughput is managed particularly at the normal peak times, particularly tea time, shortly after tea time, early evenings, for example, though it can occur at other times of the day. So the number of stations would be increased, and that's one of the things that guidance will no doubt be considered by the EMB and the CCO as to whether there should be more stations than normal. Other logistics come into play, of course, and that is the physical restrictions of buildings, etc. But it's a balance of the number of stations being increased and the number of polling staff that you have on hand to assist voters, whether they are young or old. I mean, I think we can anticipate questions being asked by voters at the polling station by any voter of any age, and we will need to have extra staff, I suspect, to cover that. And that takes us into an area that will no doubt be addressed, and that is, what is the script that we give polling staff as to how to answer those questions? Now, that has been dealt with in the past through guidance from the Electoral Commission, and I would be hoping that we would have the same kind of facility again, so that there is a consistency of approach as to what information is given. So with those factors, I think we would hopefully address the point that you're making.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer. Just moving on then to the timing of the count, again thinking of a 16, 17-year-old voting for the first time in a major referendum. People will be keen to see the result as soon as possible. It's important that that result is accurate. Has any consideration been given to the time of the count? I know my personal preference, along with a lot of politicians, is that it starts as soon as possible, so that we can get the outcome as soon as I see some of my colleagues smiling. So that we get the outcome as soon as possible. Any thoughts on that at this point?
Yes, thoughts, but clearly that's one area where the EMB and the Chief Accounting Officer will have to give consideration. It was one area that was the subject of a direction by the CCO for the AV referendum in 2011, and also in turn for the council elections. I can't say what the outcome of that will be, because clearly it's an area where there will be a need for the degree of consistency. But the principles underlining that should be, following the Gold report, is the interest of the voters, and that's in the accuracy and transparency of the count, first and foremost, rather than speed as an objective in itself. I think the timing of the count also will depend on the need to look at the logistics across the country. There are one or two areas, particularly the inner and outer Hebrides, as everybody will know, will have difficulty in getting all their boxes in and counting and overnight, for example, and a result transmitted locally to the Chief Counting Officer. There's also, I think, in terms, as far as I understand the draft referendum bill, a desire that there's a national result declared before any local results are declared. So you've got to factor that in. How is that going to impact on overnight counts, where people locally will want to know what is the result locally, and if there is to be no local declaration before any national declaration, then there will need to be clear guidance as to what the local counting officer has to do vis-à-vis the Chief Counting Officer to preserve that objective. So there are lots of factors that need to be discussed. There is the AVI checking, it's the absent voter identity checks on postal voters. There's an increasing number of postal votes come back with the ballot box at the end of close of poll, and that on 100% checking is not a slow process. And there's another little risk assessment, I think, in there as well with 16 to 17-year-olds, in that their signatures are likely to change quite a lot at that age, so we're told, till it settles down. And of course, if they put something that was a wee bit different on their postal voting statement coming back to us than what they put to the registration officer in the first place, that has difficulties. So that's not a 5-minute job. So all these logistical factors come into play, and a decision will have to be made. And I can't preempt the EMB's discussion or the Chief Counting Officer's discussion, but clearly there was stakeholder consultation before by the Chief Counting Officer on the council count timing, and I'm sure all views, including those of yourselves, will be asked for and no doubt given.
Signatures, but I'll tell you, my changes for hour to hour. So I don't know about 16 to 17-year-olds. So I think, Rob, you're out supplementary to James's.
Indeed, I did. Good morning, Gordon. There obviously has been.
See, I just remind folk we are dealing with the 16 to 17-year-old franchise bill in this particular evidence session, because it's starting to widen out a bit from that. Perhaps understandable, but that's the purpose of it.
Well, clearly, just the lessons of the 1997 referendum, which had a high turnout, might have some extra lessons to learn for us in this case. Do you think that there's anything from that would affect the way in which we should approach the one with the extended franchise for 2014?
I confess you're testing my memory about the 1997 referendum. What I would say is that the referendum that we would look most closely to begin with would be the AV referendum as to how referendums are conducted. 16 and 17-year-olds are voting for the first time, so the 97 referendum wouldn't give us, I would have thought, much insight into the coming referendum. I think what we have to gauge is what is the impact of 16 and 17-year-olds voting, and there are a number of different factors there, not least how we go about awareness raising. And there's one or two issues in the draft referendum bill on that, if you want me to expand on that. There's also issues about how we go into schools, and I think you've heard evidence from Jersey and Guernsey and the Isle of Man about going into schools and so forth. I think that's essential. My own council and other councils do that. But in the current draft referendum bill, there is no such power to encourage participation on the Chief Counting Officer or the Counting Officer. It wholly lies with the Electoral Commission. So
again, there's no such power, so I didn't quite pick that up.
There's no, as the draft referendum bill stands when it was first published, there is no power placed on the Chief Counting Officer or the Counting Officer to encourage participation in the referendum, as there was with the AV referendum in 2011. The power to engage the voters with information lies with the Electoral Commission, and that's something that we would need some clarity on in terms of activity locally. Clearly, I think we would be interested in locally in maintaining our engagement with young voters, and in this case now 16 and 17-year-olds and potentially even 15-year-olds who will become 16 by the date of the referendum. What that needs, I think, is two things. One, some clarity of the legislation before it's finalised as to our powers locally, and secondly, some robust framework that we can engage the pupils, including our own education services, in a neutral way that enables the processes of voting and getting registered to continue.
Thank you very much. I hope officials of the Scottish Government are listening into this particular bit. I've got a couple other supplementaries which I'll come to you after I've had Tavish and then Patrick, who've also got supplementaries to this area, and then Annabel Ewing. Then I'll come back to Annabel Goldie, who I think has got a wider question.
Could you clarify the remarks you made earlier on the declaration in terms of a national declaration as opposed to local declaration? I'm not sure I understood what you said there. Could you just go back to that?
I think it's in the draft referendum bill, which says that, in effect, there is to be no local declaration of the result until the national result is declared. Now, that's...
Out to Hebrides means that could take forever. And it'll be tweeted, it'll be on social media and everywhere else, because we'll all be at the counts and everything else. The practicalities of that are impossible, aren't they?
Well, I would never say anything's impossible. It's difficult to manage because you're actually absolutely right. I'd agree with you. Returning officers or counting officers will need to engage with those present, the observers, to see that what they're proposing to send to the Chief Counting Officer is fit for purpose. But doing so exposes that very danger you mentioned to leaks through social media. So that area needs to be talked through. Guidance will no doubt come out from the Chief Counting Officer as to how that will happen. But if the draft referendum bill stands as it is, then the policy objective will be no local announcements or even potentially...
Correctly, the draft referendum bill was put out in January last year. And therefore, obviously, there was lots of comment given about the bill at that time. So, and obviously, things like Tavish is raising today should hopefully, by the time we get the actual bill, some of that stuff might be reflected in it. We'll see. But it's a good point that's raised. Patrick.
You Convener. Good morning. I just wanted to pick up on the points you were making about the lack of a role that returning officers have in terms of promoting participation. And you also mentioned schools at one point. The Jersey, Guernsey, Isle of Man experiences that we've heard of, perhaps understandably because they're smaller jurisdictions, don't have that electoral commission function held by a specific body. Local authorities, though, and Solar's point of view is relevant here. Local authorities, as providers of education in schools, do have a role, and some schools are keen to have mock elections at the moment, even though they don't have voters in the classes. Others are more reticent or less keen, or think there's a barrier or a problem there. Is this something that Solar can express a view on at the moment, about the role that local authorities have through the provision of school education in participation and registration, encouraging both, and whether that will involve the facilitation of neutral panel sessions by candidates, for example, whether that's going to be something that will become a normal part of practice when the voting age is 16?
I think it's less a role for Solar. It's one more that I've already been talking to my colleague in charge of education services And I think it's more likely from an educational perspective to be taken up through the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland, so that we have a robust framework to facilitate engagement with pupils as part of the school process. Where I think solar comes in would be playing its part and putting its views into the EMB with regard to first of all, our powers hopefully available locally to encourage participation, and secondly, the kinds of areas that can be used. For example, social media. Councils now, including my own, use Facebook and Twitter regularly, and there are links then to relevant websites, the Registration Officer, the Electoral Commission's About My Vote website, etc. And where that needs is guidance as to how you monitor those sites for material that needs to be deleted quickly, whether it's offensive or party political. So that's where I think SOLAR and the EMB and the other professional associations involved with elections will come into play. But the wider picture, I think, is for the educationalists.
But would you be wanting the committee, for example, to consider a change to the bill to broaden or alter the powers that do exist for...
Yes, I think so, because otherwise I think we will be in an era of uncertainty as to what we can do locally to encourage participation in the referendum, because for elections we have that standing duty, not a power, duty. But for this referendum in the draft bill, but as the convener has said, that was the draft bill a year ago. But as it stood then, we don't have that power, and I think we should have, and it should be clarified.
If there's time for one tiny further supplementary, some of the other jurisdictions that we've heard from were able to give us an estimate of the number of 16 and 17-year-olds who did eventually participate. Do we have the process, the ability to do that after the referendum and find out how successful we were at promoting participation among that age group?
That very much depends on what initiatives happen locally within each council area. In West Lothian, we do have figures for through what we call our Democracy Challenge initiative, where the community's youth team goes into S6 as it stands at the moment and gets people registered on an annual basis, and I think the figures that we had last time were something like, I do have them with me if you want the actual figures, but we had something like 500 or thereabouts, just over, who were registered through the Democracy Challenge and also through stalls in the Civic Centre in Livingston, the shopping centre, the local college. And out of that's who would not otherwise have been registered through the canvassing. This is 2011 figures I'm talking about. And out of those, there was a check-up following that from the marked registers, and 45% voted. In round terms. Now, that took a lot of resources, and it's arguable in the current climate whether we can sustain that kind of analysis as manual. Never mind other authorities as well.
A sample like that is possible?
It is possible. Okay. It would have to be resourced and would not necessarily be widespread across the country, I suspect.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Convener.
Patrick, I've got Annabel Ewing, who's got a supplementary, then I'll come on to Annabel Goldie and then Patricia.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Blair. Just picking up on a couple of points in the evidence thus far. Just as a point of information, my recollection, which may be a bit hazy as well, of the 1997 referendum, is that the count immediately followed the close of poll. That was my recollection anyway. I just make that point for the record. But looking at the capacity issue at polling stations, I just wonder, you seem to suggest, I think, that your officers make assumptions per election on what you anticipate the turnout to be in terms of your organisation of the poll locally, and presumably those assumptions therefore change and differ from one part of the country to the next. which is the nature of assumptions, as opposed to a specific standard being pursued. And I just wonder if you could perhaps explain a wee bit more about how you make these assumptions, what the basis of these assumptions is, whether the capacity in recent elections has been in excess, if you like, in terms of the actual turnout achieved. I just wonder maybe if you could provide a wee bit more information about what you were saying earlier.
Well, we estimate turnout for each election, and of course it varies. In West Lothian it was, 62% for the UK parliamentary, 54% for the Scottish Parliament, 42% for the council elections. If it's a combined poll, it increases the number of stations, nothing to do with turnout, because you've got more ballot papers, etc. That's the first thing we look at. Then we look at experience and feedback from presiding officers, because they give us their views back from the polling stations after each election, and we can see whether there are any particular areas that we need to adjust the number of stations for future elections because of any local variations within our electoral area. The bottom line is that we need to avoid queuing at peak times. That's the objective. In my experience, we have never had excessive queuing in any of our areas, and I think generally that's the case in Scotland. And the Chief Counting Officer, I think, came out with a direction in the AV referendum in 2011 with a maximum of 2,500 electors allocated to stations. The figures we run with in Scotland are well below that. So that's the analysis we do, but there's a safety built-in margin, because the bottom line at the end of the day is you can't afford to have queuing, and it's that pre-planning that takes care of that.
That's very helpful, Ms. Webb. Just one minor point to follow on. In terms of the element to be factored in for the capacity issue, one element being the addition of 16 and 17-year-olds to the register. In terms of the overall anticipated maximum figure that could entail, do you anticipate any particular queuing issue for any individual polling place? Because I would imagine that there would be a reasonable spread of that number throughout the length and breadth of Scotland.
I think the assessment, which is still to be made, of course, will be what is the effect of 16 and 17-year-olds arriving at the polling station and asking questions and slowing down the throughput. That assessment still needs to be made, but my guess is that we will need to factor in some degree of increased capacity at polling stations. And as I said earlier, not just for 16 and 17-year-olds, but for older voters as well. And as I said before, there are two ways to do that. There's an increase in the number of stations, but there's also an increase in the number of polling staff without increasing stations to deal with people's questions, but you still then maintain the throughput of voters.
That's how, I mean, I would say, of course, that obviously you have, there's nothing new under the sun, really. I would imagine you have that experience with new voters. If one looks back at certain recent elections where there was a plethora of elections on the same day, you have had experience of having to provide quite complex information and so forth. So I would imagine that where there's a will, there's a way to secure the objective of ensuring that the poll meets the aspirations of the people of this country.
Just as a quick addition to that point, the script that we would anticipate coming from the Electoral Commission as guidance in training polling staff will give a consistent message across polling stations, and that will assist in speed in terms of answering questions and throughput. So there's a number of all these factors come together to deal with the issue of potential queuing.
Annabel Goldie.
Just before we leave, sure, Mr. Blair, I mean, this is not like normal elections in the sense there's going to be one bit of paper with one question on it. I'm just interested in what people are going to be asking you. I know what I'd like to tell them, but I'm interested in what they'll be asking you.
Oh, I think, in my experience, polling staff can be asked anything under the sun. You're asking what's asked at polling stations by voters? Yes. Yeah.
general or Scottish Parliament election where there are screeds of political parties and individual candidates. This is one question with, I think, 2 boxes.
Yes. Well, when we come to the guidance on doubtful voters, doubtful ballot papers, Freudian slip there. Doubtful ballot papers, you can see some variations on what they put down, yes and no's in both boxes rather than ticks. But no, there will be questions we anticipate that people will ask. And the polling staff will have to have a script, as they've had before, to remain impartial, to answer or decline to answer some of the questions. But you're absolutely right, it is a straightforward ballot paper. It's about as simple as you could get in theory.
And the other thing I don't know the answer to, I'm assuming this is the count will be manual with bits of paper. Yeah, that's very reassuring. Can I ask you, Mr. Blair, in an ideal world, what period of time would you like between the legislation changing the franchise coming into force and the date of the poll?
I can answer that not being involved in the registration side, obviously, and I think you've heard from colleagues from the SAA, Brian Byrne and Joan Houghton. I think that the basic rule there is if you follow the gold recommendation, the 6-month rule for legislation, then that's as good as we can expect, and we are happy with that.
And, Convener, if I can just ask a second question. If we overlay onto this the possibility of the application of individual voter registration with all the current uncertainties about that timetable, does that introduce a fairly major factor?
Yes, and I think I read the transcript of Brian and Joan's evidence to you the end of last month, and I think that is a factor that needs to be bottomed out, not least because they have got to, as you heard, produce the new register, particularly the young persons register.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Yes, really, just to follow up on that, if I may, Mr. Blair, good morning. Clearly, we have been asked to curtail, to an extent, the process that we would normally go through in considering a bill in order to allow electoral registration officers to have the maximum amount of time prior to the canvass that takes place in the autumn. Presumably, you and your colleagues are anticipating that to an extent and are working towards that. So I just wonder how much anticipation you can actually take forward at this stage, and how much, as a corollary, you have to wait for us to actually get the legislation through.
You're absolutely right. Everybody's anticipating the legislation. We're anticipating the European ballot, although I wish we knew the date, but that will come from Brussels, presumably. But we know it's June 2014. We know it's going to be autumn 2014 for the referendum, and we know it's the first Thursday in May in 2015 for the UK general. All 3 polls come together. We have back-to-back polls. You work it out, it's less than 12 months from start to finish of those polls, and that affects our pre-planning. So we're already beginning to think in terms of our polling schemes, because there'll be different questions asked by the different polls at each of these elections. And the EMB will no doubt be starting to think about this as well. No doubts about that. And we are anticipating the strategic issues and beginning to plan for those both nationally and locally.
I'd like to know the date of the referendum. And I wonder whether that uncertainty is an additional hurdle that you and your colleagues face.
It's probably more an uncertainty for the registration side, but we know it's the autumn. In terms of the major building blocks, it's not holding us back, to be honest, at this stage. The building blocks are your polling scheme, your IT systems, I'm not talking about registration IT systems, I'm talking about the returning officer side, your staffing profile, whether you need to renew that, and so forth. We can do all the significant major building blocks at this point in time. But obviously what we want is the detail at least 6 months before polling day.
Is there anything that you can't anticipate that you really need to know in order to allow you to work ahead? Oh, well.
Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything at the moment. I think we can hopefully anticipate most things and have a good guess as to what is likely to happen. But that's where the EMB, remember the EMB has representatives from the Electoral Commission and the Scottish Government and, for that matter, the Scotland Office as advisors to it. So the EMB is up to speed with the trends, what's being talked about, both here in Edinburgh and down in London as well, if we're talking about a UK parliamentary election. So it can see what's coming over the horizon and assist, get its own plans into shape and assist us locally. And I say that I happen to be an advisor to the EMB, but I'm not here as an EMB representative here today, of course. So we can anticipate, I think, most eventualities, hopefully.
Okay, I don't see anybody else indicating they want to ask any questions. Gordon, thank you very much for coming along and giving us actually some very, very useful evidence in such a cogent and clear manner. I think it was very helpful to us. And also taking questions that went beyond strictly what we were actually asked you to do. So I'm very grateful for you being able to take a wider range of questions than perhaps you expected as well. So thank you very much, sir, for coming along. And that takes us on to the next item on the agenda, item 2, which is about the Referendum-Franchise-Bill and a further paper and considering our approach to the scrutiny of the proposed bill at stage 1. The various details are laid out by the clerk in the paper in terms of the draft call for evidence on the 22nd of March. Obviously, the Deputy First Minister coming along on the 28th of March. Those unable to meet the deadline of the 22nd of March, given a fallback deadline of the 12th of April to ensure that all evidence that we can possibly gather is gathered in. Of course, we could write to, if we require, if there's any later evidence comes in, write to the DFM to get a response. The paper also suggests to the committee an overview of who might take oral evidence from on 3 dates on the 14th, 21st and 28th of March. There is a small error in the paper which was sent out to you by email last night in terms of the Information Commissioner's Office for Scotland who deals with the data, not the Scottish Information Commissioner. So I'm really seeking now, I think a reasonable paper laid out, but I'm sure people have views and where on all of this. And with the Fabiani, I think you had a view on this.
I did. It was one thing I think is really, really important is that we get the views of young people on this bill in particular. And I'm glad that we're keen in a session there with the Youth Parliament and the NUS. I'm not convinced that we should have the Commissioner for Children and Young People in the same panel as that. I think we should give the young folks their voices themselves. And the other thing I'd like to suggest there is that perhaps we pull in Young Scot as well, because they're, from what I've looked at with them, they're very representative of young people right across the spectrum in very many ways, and work in all local authority areas, etc. So I'd quite like to see Young Scot in there somewhere too.
So tell us a bit more about Young Scots, others, so that we can inform the...
Well, I can only give an almost elderly person's view of Young Scot.
Okay, fair point. I'm just trying to make sure we get as much information out into the air as possible. So you're suggesting we bring in... So let me get that right. You're suggesting
I would say Young Scot are representative of young people right across Scotland. They're also very highly respected by all the youth organisations, etc. And from what I can see, they're pretty well informed on lots of issues. And I just think it would be a missed opportunity not to have them there. And I would really visualise the panel of young people being for young people's voices. And nothing against the Commissioner for Children and Young People. But I just think that we should have a panel which is all young people themselves speaking with us.
Okay, let me canvass some of the views. Stuart Maxwell has said he wants to have add in, and so does Patrick.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Convener. I mean, I don't have any problem with that. It's not. I think that's actually probably a quite sensible suggestion, having all the young people on a panel together without and again, no offence to Mr Bailey, but the young people speaking for themselves on that panel. But my point was actually about some of the other possible oral witnesses. I thought, frankly, there was an overlap, and we could have at least two of these individuals together, and I'm specifically speaking about the Information Commissioner's Office for Scotland and the chair of the Scottish Child Protection Committee Chairs Forum. I think there's an overlap there in terms of kind of some of the stuff we'll be talking about in terms of data protection, and we'll be asking them both similar. I know there'll be slight differences, but effectively quite an overlap there. And it would seem to me sensible to have the two of them on the same panel rather than on separate panels. And I suppose if you're talking about child protection and some of these issues, I hadn't thought about it until Linda said, but the Commissioner for Children and Young People probably could also fit on that panel. So you'd have a young person's panel and then a Commissioners and others panel.
Oh, sorry, I think that's quite wise. I don't know other
Thank you very much.
Patrick and then Annabel.
Just this issue about the relationship between promoting registration and promoting participation, and what possible role schools in particular might have. I wonder if there's sense in trying to have some space for heads of education in local authorities, or some kind of perspective about that. I would imagine that on the main bill, when we come to that, we'll want to hear from the campaigns on both sides about the main bill. I'm not sure it's necessary to think about whether there are groups that already represent young people who'll be campaigning for or against, who want to give evidence on the franchise bill. But I certainly think that we need to address the question about what role schools have specifically in promoting not just registration but participation.
If I remember correctly, and I can't remember what they're called, there's an organisation that represents directors of education. There is. I can't remember what it's called. So there's an umbrella organisation there that we could, whatever it is, which would, rather than
Education Scotland,
so that's the sort of body, an umbrella organisation that could come in and give us that sort of evidence. And I guess the place we should, if we're going to bring them in, we should slot them alongside would be somebody like the Electoral Commission, because that's that whole area of participation and encouragement. Okay? Right, I think I'm getting the picture. Annabel?
Patrick's preempting. That was a point I was going to raise. Okay. I thought we needed more from, and I just jotted down here, could we get even two of the biggest local authorities to give their heads of education? So I think that's covered. The way I looked at it, Convener, was, the two bodies I definitely want to hear from are the Electoral Commission and the Electoral Management Board. And the other thing, I don't know what the rest of the committee feels, is I honestly think if you stray beyond two panels of evidence, you begin to lose the sharpness and the focus of interrogation and response. And my desire would be to try and rest with, two panels per session. And if that puts pressure, I might suggest, could the Electoral Reform Society not be asked to give written evidence? I'm not quite sure.
Well, there's only one panel on that day, unless we had somebody else in on the same day as the DFM.
The other thing I did wonder about was, and it's rather along the lines, I know we've got this, the chair of the Scottish Child Protection Committee Chairs Forum, but actually I was wondering if we couldn't maybe bulk that out a little with, and again, it's rather like the body you're talking about, Stuart, the heads of social work in Scotland. It's the people that work with fragile, vulnerable youngsters and who are at the cold face of trying to protect them. And I think it'd be helpful to the committee to have some...
We've got this already suggested to us, the chairs of the Scottish Child Protection Committees.
Yes, but I'm saying that's a global organisation. It's a composite organisation. It's just a suggestion.
Well, we've got 3 dates. We've got, let me just try and encapsulate this and then see if we can move on from there. We've got 3 dates. The first date, the 14th. I think from what we've heard from Linda and the reaction from that perhaps the way to do that would be to have the Youth Parliament people, the NUS and Young Scot as one panel on the 14th, and that gives us quite a significant issue just for young people on that day. On the 21st, it's almost like a Commissioner's Day. So you've got the children's... Well, I think with Stuart not suggesting, though, the Information Commissioner and the child protection folk and the Children's Commissioner could all come on the same day?
I was, yes, in the same panel, yeah.
So we're dealing with one panel on one day, and so we're getting these bodies together at once. I think that was the suggestion.
Yeah, but you could have two panels on the same morning, because that's doable, I would have thought. You could have young people and then the commissioners in the next panel on the same day dealing with issues from their perspective. And you've got the young person's perspective, which is the young person's issue.
So that's all on the 14th. Then on the 21st, we've got the Electoral Commission and perhaps the ADES, or what they're called, the Directors of Education and the group. Another panel on the same day, which is the Electoral Management Board, the Scottish Assessors Association and the Association of Electoral Administrators, all of which are on the list provided to us by the clerks. That leaves the 28th of March, potentially a panel, and I'll come back to your point, Annabelle, about the social work side of things. It's potentially a panel, if we're going to have them, with the Electoral Reform Society and the Deputy First Minister on the same day.
Just to help you, Convener, the Electoral Reform Society kind of won. They've got what they want, so I thought Annabelle's point about allowing them to give evidence in written form is a good idea. That would deal with your problem of a panel also appearing on the same day as the Deputy First Minister, who then doesn't get the chance to review their evidence. So I was a bit puzzled as to why the Electoral Reform Society want to give evidence, or they can give written.
It's not just about the issue of 16 and 17-year-olds policy, though, is it? It's about the wider issues of the engagement, the wider issues of participation.
Okay, the other question is, what do they add that we're not going to get from the other panels?
I'm not going to die in a ditch on this.
I'm trying to help.
So, if there's a general feeling that we don't require them, then fair enough.
Take it as written evidence.
Yeah, and that leaves us with the DFM in that case on the 28th. Now, the reason I suggested, Annabelle, that we'll have a body that encapsulates all of the directors of education to come along and give it this evidence. I think if we're going to have something from the social work side, we can do the same, because there's a body that represents all the social work side in Scotland as well. And they should, and by nature, sit alongside then the chair of the Scottish Child Protection Committee chairs. And I'll leave the clerks to work out all the timing, all of this, and the synergy to make sure it all works. Is that reasonable?
Yeah.
Okay.
Moving on, and excuse me if we already have this information, but in terms of the call for written evidence, I note that there's a reference to the fact that this will be flagged up to the media as well as to stakeholders, and I just don't know who these stakeholders are. Could I possibly get a list of? I mean, who or do we have a list? I mean, I don't know who you, when you reference stakeholders in this context, who you're referring to.
Andrew.
Yeah, I think in this context, all we're envisaging is just a general call for evidence being issued through the normal Parliament channels. And the media, our media office just draws that to attention of the media generally. I'm not necessarily thinking of targeting it particularly, but if members have suggestions of...
The contacts and stakeholders, I just wondered who the and stakeholders were, that's all.
I think we will simply try and draw the attention of those we think are obvious. If members have suggestions of particular stakeholders, we're happy to take those into account.
The list is, if that's possible? Well, there presumably will be a list at some point in order to send it to them. No, I'm fine. Thank you, Tavish. I was just curious to see who...
Well, if a member wants to see who gets the information, then the member will want to see it. And it's a reasonable thing to ask for. Anything else? Okay, let me move on to the closing part of this particular session then. Next week, obviously, we'll have an informal briefing from the Scottish Government officials on the Franchise Bill itself, and that might or might not widen out to other issues, considering what we've heard today, but I think we should try to contain it to the Franchise Bill, because that's what we've asked them to come to speak to us about. And we had a general discussion about having a meeting on the 7th of March, and there was an agreement that we should do that to agree the themes for the oral evidence-taking sessions at stage 1, which will begin shortly on the Franchise Bill. And I suggest that particular item be taken in private on the 28th, because it just allows us to freewheel a bit in terms of what we want to ask. And therefore, the next meeting of the committee will be on the 7th of March in private, followed by Thursday the 14th of March, when we'll take stage 1 oral evidence on the franchise bill. But obviously, I just did agree that we'd do that in private, Andrew. Thank you very much, folks. Very grateful to you.
Thanks, Convener.
Sorry.